Committee will now come to order. Chair will now recognize himself 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing before us today to discuss a range of legislative proposals intended to address challenges facing the American people and those responsible for helping them in times of crisis. The bills before the subcommittee today include Chairman Pallone and Mr. McNerney's Resilient Networks Act, Ms. Eshu's Wired Act, the READI Act introduced by Mr. McNerney, Mr. Bilirakis, and Mr. Olson, Mr. Ingalls' Don't Break Up the T-Band Act, Ms. Matsui's and Ms. Eshu's Emergency Reporting Act, Mr. Thompson's Phone Act, Mr. Moulton and Mr. Stewart's National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, and Ranking Member Walden's First Responder Act. In the last few years, resiliency has taken on a new meaning. Our nation has faced a surge of extreme weather events, from Superstorm Sandy in New Jersey and New York to severe hurricanes in Puerto Rico, the Gulf, and the southern eastern United States. Puerto Rico in particular has been hit hard with multiple hurricanes. In this most recent earthquake, thousands of people lost their lives and they are still struggling to reconnect critical infrastructure. The federal government simply has not done enough. We must do better for the people there. In California, people have seen their state ravaged by some of the worst wildfires in history. These fires haven't just burned down homes, they've destroyed whole communities. In the Midwest, communities have experienced record flooding and crop losses. More and more exceptional weather events that used to occur once in a generation are becoming a regular occurrence. Human-caused climate change is driving this shift in our weather patterns, and while we work to combat even worse effects in the future, we need to deal with this new normal now. Our nation's communications infrastructure is a lifeline to those facing exigent circumstances, and it needs to be ready to take on the challenges we know it will face, whether that be fires, floods, Category 5 winds, or 911 call centers outages, a public safety emergency in a major city, or a personal crisis that could cost someone their life. In each case, communication networks that are ready and resilient to the challenges we know they will face can be the difference between life and death. It's my hope that as we examine legislation before us today, we can come together and find common ground, because while each of our districts has some unique challenges, we can all acknowledge that our communities are safer and stronger when folks can communicate with each other and access the resources they need in an emergency. With that, I'd like to yield a minute to my good friend, Mr. McNerney, and then after his minute, a minute to Ms. Eshu.
Well, I thank the chairman for holding this hearing and for yielding a minute to me. This year, we're witnessing the driest February on record in much of Northern California, which is where my district is located. As experts warn about the possibility of early and more intense wildfire season, it's imperative that we help individuals stay connected during these natural disasters. This situation is in part why I've introduced H.R. 5926, the Resilient Networks Act, with Chairman Pallone. This legislation would make critical improvements to the reliability of our communications network. I've also introduced H.R. 4856, the READI Act, with my colleagues, Mr. Bilirakis and Mr. Olson. This legislation would help ensure that we have a robust wireless emergency alerting system. Additionally, I've asked the chairman of the FCC to hold a hearing in Northern California to examine the cell tower outages that occurred during recent wildfires. Chairman Pai committed to me that he would hold this hearing. I look forward to hearing from him about the details of when and where it will be held. And now I yield to my colleague, Ms. Eshu.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank you, Chairman Doyle, for not only yielding time, but for also holding this very important meeting. On October 28th of last year, 874 cell towers were out in California, caused by wildfires and power shutoffs. My constituents were worried sick that they wouldn't be able to call 911 during emergencies, receive emergency alerts, or download public safety information. Our wildfires are getting more intense because of climate change, and PG&E, the major utility, estimates that shutoffs will impact nearly 2 million Californians this year. So without real changes, I really worry that our telecom problem will once again worsen the impacts of these disasters. And it's why I've introduced the Wired Act, which clarifies that states can require carriers to take measures to make wireless infrastructure more resilient to disasters, such as requiring backup power. We have to have this, and the ambiguities in the law today are cleared away by this legislation. I'm grateful that we're also considering Congresswoman Matsui's bill, which I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of, and I look forward to a very productive hearing. I thank all the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, thank you for grouping these bills and having the hearing so that they can move on. These bills collectively are going to make a real difference in the lives of Californians and others across the country, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. Latta, the ranking member for the subcommittee, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I greatly appreciate you holding today's hearing. And good morning, and welcome to today's hearing to discuss a variety of public safety-related legislation. I also want to thank our witnesses for sharing their experiences with us on dealing with the day-to-day challenges associated with the concepts in these legislative proposals. So thanks again for being here. Public safety communications provide an important lifeline to consumers, and as we make advancements in technology, we must be careful to make sure transitions are done thoughtfully, are transparent, and have public input. While many of the bills before us have good intentions to improve the resiliency of our emergency communications systems, we must ensure that these bills receive proper attention so their goals are achieved. First, the subcommittee is examining H.R. 1289, the Phone Act, which would provide a moratorium on number reassignment after a natural disaster. I believe we can all agree that consumers shouldn't lose their phone number after their home is destroyed from a fire or a hurricane. But whatever remedy we use to protect consumers must be manageable for companies that provide voice service to tens of millions of consumers. Without taking that into account, we could cause more confusion for Americans already reeling from disasters. If there is a concern with the Commission's current process for obtaining a waiver of the aging rule, that is something we should study. I believe that these and other challenges can be overcome, and I'm committed to working with my friends in the majority to see if there is a path forward. However, I caution against moving such important legislation without due consideration under regular order. I am pleased that we're considering the First Responder Act, which repeals the T-band auction mandate while addressing the issue of 911 fee diversion by states, as well as my colleague from New York's bill, Don't Break the T-band Act. These bills address critical bipartisan issues that, if not addressed, put the entire 911 and public safety system at risk. We will also discuss H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. Last Congress, this committee unanimously passed the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act, which tasked the FCC with studying whether to designate an N11 three-digit short code for National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Chairman Pai has announced his intention to move forward on designating 988. And I applaud this decision. And I was pleased to host the chairman recently in Toledo, Ohio, at a visit of the Rescue Mental Health and Addiction Services and National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Crisis Center. At the center, we learned the number of hotline calls that needed answering in Ohio increased by 70% from 2016 to 2018. With suicide rates growing at an alarming rate across our nation, we need to make sure that the prevention services are there, and they have never been needed more than they are needed today. We must ensure resources like 988 are available for at-risk Americans to get the help they need. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I appreciate you holding today's hearing, and thank our witnesses for being here to testify today, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee is considering a number of important bills to improve communication networks, particularly in times of emergency. The fact is that climate change is causing more frequent and more severe disasters, and a functioning communications network can be the difference between life and death in these situations. And we have a responsibility to ensure our networks are prepared for this stark reality. One of the bills we're considering today is the Resilient Networks Act, which I introduced with Representative McNerney. This legislation picks up where the Sandy Act left off and will ensure that communication networks are prepared for the worst when disaster strikes. When networks go down, it's critical that providers share information about outages and restoration efforts with 911 call centers and first responders. They need access to outage reports to better keep us safe. And I want to thank the Association of Public Safety Communications officials for letting us know about the need to address this issue, and I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter a letter from APCO into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection. So
Thank you. So the bill, the Resilient Networks Act, also makes certain that providers have pre-planned roaming agreements and mutual aid agreements in place ahead of time. This coordination can mean the difference between life and death. When a storm or wildfire strikes, it's essential that people can still make calls to 911 or to loved ones. Service is also critical to receiving emergency alerts that provide life-saving information. In an instance where one carrier's network is working and another goes down, having a plan in place beforehand to seamlessly transition subscribers onto the working network is common sense and can save lives. Perhaps the most frustrating challenge of all is outages that happen during the recovery phase after storms or disasters have passed. Far too many networks go down due to accidental cuts into the networks when restoration efforts are well underway. And our bill directs the FCC to examine ways to stop these preventable outages, and I look forward to seeing the results of their analysis. I'm also pleased that the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act is listed for consideration today, and thank Representatives Stuart Moulton and Eddie Bernice Johnson for their leadership on this issue. Every day, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline saves lives, and reports from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration and the FCC say that making 988 the dialing code for the Lifeline will save more lives. This bill will make it easier for people experiencing a mental health crisis to access help. In my state of New Jersey, 100 young people aged 15 to 24 died by suicide in 2017, the highest number and rate since the 1990s. Tragically, rates are climbing across the board at the national level, too. The statistics are particularly alarming for LGBTQ youth, who are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their peers. According to the Trevor Project's national survey, 39% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year, including more than half of transgender or non-binary youth. And it's vital that we do all that we can to turn these trends. And finally, I wanted to thank our Ranking Member Walden and Representatives Engel, Eshoo, McNerney, Matsui, and Thompson for their important work on other bills being considered today. And I wanted to yield the remainder of my time to Representative Matsui, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and Chairman Doyle for holding this important, timely hearing. The natural disasters we'll examine at today's hearing were just a few years ago, irregularities, unavoidable but uncommon events. Today, these once-in-a-generation storms and fires have become all too common occurrence. In 2019 alone, wildfires in California damaged or destroyed 732 structures and burned almost 260,000 acres. Worst of all, 3 lives were lost. As destructive as these fires were, we know that they are not an anomaly. Wildfire season is getting longer, wildfire incidents are becoming more common, and their intensity is increasing. In the face of this evolving threat, we must adopt a holistic approach, one that addresses environmental, economic, and human factors that contribute to our changing climate. Additionally, as we will discuss at this hearing, we need to take immediate steps to ensure our networks can perform as intended during emergencies. The shortcomings of our network performance were laid bare by Hurricane Maria, the Thomas Fire, and Superstorm Sandy. This committee has an obligation to move quickly and collaboratively to advance legislation that will help prepare our country for the natural disasters of tomorrow. That is why I work with my colleagues, Representative Eshoo, Thompson, and Huffman, to introduce the Emergency Reporting Act. This bill will establish a standardized emergency reporting process at the FCC and improve standards that require mobile carriers to report network messages to 911 centers. The FCC needs to do a better job in response to crises. My bill will ensure that the FCC conducts field hearings, issues reports, and makes policy recommendations on all major disasters, regardless of their location, so no community will again be left wondering, what can we do to better prepare for the next one? It would also improve the flow of information to 911 centers when there are network outages in their service territory that prevent consumers from completing 911 calls, or when emergency calls do not include vital information like location or number data. While existing outage reporting requirements exist at the FCC, the notification threshold is high and can lead to situations in which 911 centers are left in the dark about service outages in their territory, jeopardizing public safety. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, Ranking Member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening
Morning,
statement.
Mr. Chairman.
Good morning.
And I want to welcome our witnesses and guests today. I just want to say on these wildfires, we've been facing this in the Northwest for a long time. I was just looking up, in 1910 was the giant fire in Idaho that burned, I think, something like 3 million acres and took 86 lives, mostly firefighters on the front lines. So this is something some of us have been dealing with for a long time. Yes, it's getting worse. Yes, climate change is impacting it. But we've got to do work to get our forests back in balance and get the excess fuel loads out. And we need your help to do that on both sides of the aisle. We've got legislation to do that in the Resilient Forest Act. And then we need to replant. And we have a Trillion Trees project that I think can make a real difference for the ecology, and trees are our lungs, and the world's lungs, and can take and return oxygen to the environment. We need to do that too. And we need to make our networks resilient. I was in the radio business for 20 years. I've covered a lot of fires. I've worked closely with emergency personnel. I've been on the scenes of fires and accidents, and I've been out making my own generator work at my radio station. When it would go out, I've turned tower lights on in the middle of the day so rescue helicopters and fog could land at the nearby hospital. This is really important work, but we have to get it right, and that's why we look forward to working with you on the Resilience Act. But we need to get it right. You know, the Resilient Networks Act put forth by the chairman, I appreciate his work on it. I know it's been a focus of his and others for a long time, especially since Superstorm Sandy. Now, we did include his Sandy Act in the Ray Bombs Act in the last Congress when I chaired the committee. This addressed some complicated issues we examined, and we did it in a bipartisan and timely way. The Resilient Networks Act attempts to address concerns related to making sure wireless networks are restored in a timely and efficient manner during times of emergency. But this bill has not been through the kind of examination I think, Mr. Chairman, it really deserves and needs. It is a very important topic, and we got to get it right. I commend the chairman for taking initial steps to examine these issues in depth. In October of 2019, Chairman Pallone requested a GAO study to investigate and evaluate the failures in response to restoring communications in Puerto Rico after the devastating hurricane, to see what happened during that crisis and what can be improved. Without objection, I'd like to offer his letter for the record, Mr. Chairman. We've not yet seen the results from
So ordered.
We've not yet, thank you, the study, which may inform how Congress could address the issues contemplated in the Resilient Network Act. So we asked for the information so we could learn what to get right, and I wish we would wait to act until we get that. The FCC is also taking steps to address these issues. In fact, the Commission is voting tomorrow on an item to provide state and federal agencies with access to outage data. In many cases, having access to wireless communications during a natural disaster can save lives. So, Mr. Chairman, it's important that we get this policy right. As we'll hear today, the wireless industry has made some great strides over the last several years to expand their wireless resiliency cooperative framework, which is a voluntary process to enhance coordination in times of an emergency. This framework must remain flexible so we can allow best practices and lessons learned to evolve without creating unnecessary barriers to restoration. Every disaster is different. I've seen that firsthand. So communications providers and their partners need sufficient flexibility to adapt to specific situations. States are also at the forefront of a lot of this work, as we've seen with wildfires out west in Oregon or the tragic ones in California. As you know, state regulators have jurisdiction over electric distribution. We must be mindful of how they're addressing this issue so we do not disrupt those efforts with heavy federal regulations, and we must also be mindful to not expand the Federal Communications Commission's jurisdiction to include the electric distribution or transmission system, where they have no relevant expertise. But we cannot talk about the importance of the resiliency of the 911 system while turning a blind eye to the flagrant and obvious attempts to undermine the system's integrity and, dare I say, resiliency. That's why I'm also pleased to discuss the First Responder Act today. Over the last several years, I've sought to find a consensus solution to the T-band auction mandate that was included in the 2012 Spectrum Act and address related issues, including the efficient use of public safety spectrum and diversion of 911 fees. The First Responder Act would repeal the T-band auction mandate and include strong provisions to address the shameful acts by some states of diverting 911 fees intended for the maintenance and upgrade to next generation 911. While some states may not have clear understanding of what is a 911 expenditure, other state politicians have made a more conscious decision to divert 911 fees to spend the money on pet projects unrelated to public policy. So the First Responder Act addresses both concerns. It gives well-intentioned states clarity on how to prevent 911 fee diversion in the future, but also would take steps to investigate whether criminal penalties or other tools could end the shameful practice of fee diversion by the worst offenders. So that, Mr. Chairman, I'll just conclude by saying we should also keep in mind the role of ham radio operators. I may be one of the few in the Congress. It's actually an amateur radio operators, but I've seen them play a key role in emergency situations too when everything else fails. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. So I'd now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Sue Ann Atkerson, CEO of Behavioral Health Link, Mr. Daniel Henry, Regulatory Counsel and Director of Government Affairs, National Emergency Number Association, Mr. Alan Bell, Distribution Manager, Georgia Power Company, Mr. Anthony Gosner, Fire Chief, City of Santa Rosa, California, Mr. Matthew Gerst, Vice President, Regulatory Affairs for CTIA, and last but not least, Mr. Joseph Torres, Senior Director of Strategy and Engagement, Free Press and Free Press Action. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statements. But before we begin, I'd like to explain the lighting system. In front of you is a series of lights. The light will initially be green. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute remaining. Please wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time has expired, and if you keep talking, a trap door will open under your seat and whisk you away. So with that admonishment, Ms. Atkerson, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Can you pull your microphone up closer to you, please? Yeah.
Thank
There you
you. Good morning, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me today and for your leadership in strengthening the country's suicide prevention and crisis care services. By designating 988 as the dialing code for suicide prevention services, the Bipartisan National Suicide Hotline Designation Act, H.R. 4194, is a historic step towards saving more American lives. And I should know. My name is Sue Ann Atkerson, and I've spent more than 25 years working to prevent suicide. I'm the CEO of Behavioral Health Link in Atlanta, Georgia, and COO for RI International based in Phoenix, Arizona. BHL provides a 24/7 community-based call center hub and mobile outreach, and RI International offers facility-based crisis services in 8 states. Working together, these programs deliver a full continuum of best practice crisis service care. I have 3 points to share today. 1, suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States. 2, faster access to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline will save lives. And 3, funding and specialized services are essential for success. Before I go into detail on these, I want to share a story that illustrates why we're all here today. Misha Kessler. The 988 code is precisely what Misha Kessler, a now mental health advocate from Ohio, needed when he experienced suicidal ideation as a sophomore at George Washington University. During a particularly difficult time, he planned to jump out of his 6th-floor dorm window to his death. Without other options, Misha ended up in an inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. Misha's experience would likely have been different had 988 existed. His 988 call would have been redirected to the Lifeline, where local call centers de-escalate 98% of calls, getting people the help they need immediately. The sooner we can intervene to help a person in crisis, the more lives we can save. That's why the 988 dial code and a fully funded Lifeline is so important. I'll begin with some background on the suicide epidemic. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death of Americans overall and the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 34. We lost nearly 50,000 Americans to suicide in 2018. Of particular relevance to the chair and ranking member, Pennsylvania ranked 4th in the nation for suicide deaths and Ohio ranked 5th. Some populations are particularly vulnerable to suicide. LGBTQ youth, for example, are 4 times more likely than their heterosexual peers to contemplate suicide, and the incidence rates for transgendered youth have skyrocketed in recent years. Secondly, faster access to the Lifeline will save lives. Research shows that the time between a person deciding to act and attempting suicide can be as short as 5 to 10 minutes. That means there is a critical period for intervention, similar to the so-called golden hour of a stroke, meaning that time is of the essence. 53 years ago, the FCC established 911, transforming emergency care in this country by making access to trained medical professionals available to anyone, anywhere, anytime. Today, Americans in mental health distress often turn to our medical system. Landing in an overcrowded emergency rooms that are often ill-equipped to address psychiatric needs can lead to delays in accessing appropriate care. When they do get treatment, it comes at a very high cost, not only to the patient, but also to taxpayers in the form of emergency medical services and law enforcement resources. Adopting 988 will allow direct, immediate access to trained mental health professionals whose rapid intervention often results in life-saving actions. Lastly, funding and specialized services are essential to success. The Lifeline network of accredited crisis centers must be fully funded and well-equipped to handle specialized needs of callers as call volume increases. Estimates indicate the potential for calls to double in the first year, reaching upwards of 5 million. Full funding of the Lifeline is critical to success, and we will undoubtedly need a braided funding approach. This includes giving states the authority to levy fees such as a service charge revenue through wireless carriers. We also need to strengthen partnerships between the Lifeline and specialty suicide prevention resources. In fact, the Senate Companion Bill 2661 directs SAMHSA to create an implementation plan for specialized services for LGBTQ youth and other at-risk populations, which could include training crisis counselors and integrated voice response to route calls to specialized organizations. We encourage the House of Representatives to adopt this language. In conclusion, it is the consensus of the mental health community, including the operators of the Lifeline, that Congress should pass H.R. 4194, providing faster access to a fully funded Lifeline network with specialized services for our most at-risk populations will save American lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Henry, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Daniel Henry. I'm Regulatory Counsel and Director of Government Affairs for NENA, the 911 Association. With over 16,000 members across the United States, NENA is the leading professional association in the 911 space. Thanks also to the members of the Congressional Next Gen 911 Caucus, including co-chairs, Representatives Eshoo and Shimkus, as well as many other members of this committee, including Chairman Pallone and Chairman Doyle. We appreciate your support. Built in the days of copper landline trunks, 911 now answers around 80% of its 300 million annual calls from mobile phones, most of them smartphones with advanced location and data sharing capabilities. Unfortunately, America's 911 system is still years behind the smartphone revolution. Modernizing it faces 4 perennial challenges: decentralized governance, inadequate and inconsistent funding, human resources challenges, and evolving technology. Public safety answering points, or PSAPs, vary widely from community to community, as noted. Each of these settings has its own unique needs, conventions, technology, and funding models. It would be impossible to impose a single cookie-cutter model for 911 in every jurisdiction in the United States. With varied governance comes varied funding means. While 911 fees are traditionally levied as line items on subscriber phone bills, funding models also vary. In some cases, there are uniform statewide fees. In others, counties levy the fees. Regardless of how the money is collected, adequate funding streams are required for both technology upgrades and for daily operations of 911. What constitutes an allowable 911 expenditure also varies from one state to the next. While one state may define anything within the walls of the PSAP as 911 spending, another may extend that definition to all kinds of public safety equipment. More challenging still is some states' practice of diverting funds collected through 911 fees to unrelated issues. According to data collected by the FCC, in 2018 alone, 5 states diverted a total of $187 million in consumer-paid 911 fees. Most people would agree that when we pay a 911 fee, that money should go to 911. Raids on 911 funds must cease, both to maintain today's level of service and to accelerate the transition to next generation 911. Our 911 system also plays a critical role during disasters as the primary intake of information to public safety. During Hurricane Harvey, for instance, Houston 911 processed 75,000 calls during the course of a single weekend, more than 4.5 times its normal call volume. In the aggregate, these calls become crowdsourced intelligence for public safety, providing thousands of details in real time and helping authorities stay safe and do their jobs. The 911 system also serves as an early warning system for, quote, blue sky outages, as was the case in December 2018, when a major nationwide outage was brought to light only by sharply dropping 911 call volumes. Threats to connectivity are exacerbated in this legacy 911 environment, where specialized 911 trunks and selective routers create single points of failure in the network. It is thus imperative that these facilities be supported by more reliable, frequently tested sources of backup power and connectivity. It is also crucial that telecommunications providers and 911 work hand in hand to tackle outage reporting and analysis so that they may work together to address current outages and prevent future ones. Many of these challenges will be alleviated by the transition to next generation 911, whereas legacy 911 is based on voice-only 20th century technology. NG is a standards-based, IP-powered system of systems that brings 911 into the 21st century. To enhance resiliency, NG 911 will allow for seamless rollover of operations when PSAPs experience an outage or are overwhelmed with calls. It will allow PSAPs to connect to 911 networks through multiple, cost-effective pathways, and it will make our 911 systems more secure and more resilient against cyber attacks. Finally, it will allow for faster upgrades and solutions to problems and innovations as they arise in the marketplace. The fiscal burden of this transition cannot be borne solely by states and localities alone. The National 911 Office estimates the NG transition will cost around $12 billion nationwide, above and beyond the day-to-day operating costs of our current 911 systems. Industry and public safety have worked together for over a decade to develop the technical and operational standards, governance models, and best practices for next generation 911. It's been tested in numerous real-world environments. In short, 911 is ready for this transition. We're deeply grateful, Mr. Chairman, that you and your committee have called this hearing to consider several pieces of legislation to improve America's 911 systems. We believe that significant improvements can be made soon in practically every community's 911 systems, and that Congress's investment will deliver priceless returns. We at NENA look forward to working with you and with all stakeholders to ensure the continued success of 911 and an accelerated transition to NG 911. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Alan Bell. I serve as a Distribution Support Manager for Georgia Power. I'm also a member of the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee and serve on its Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group. I have nearly 3 decades of experience working disaster response and recovery and communication issues in the electric power industry, including serving 15 years on Georgia's 811 board. Georgia Power is the largest subsidiary of Southern Company, one of the nation's largest generators of electricity. We serve 9 million customers in 6 states, and our communication service provider, SouthernLink, operates over 127,000 square mile service territory covering Georgia, Alabama, southeastern Mississippi, and the panhandle of Florida. The electric power industry invests more than $110 billion a year to modernize the grid. Georgia Power just had more than $1 billion in grid investment approved by the Georgia Public Service Commission. I appreciate Chairman Pallone and Congressman McCurney's leadership by introducing the Resilient Networks Act. This is a serious issue that is currently being addressed by a number of voluntary cross-sector efforts. While these efforts should be given the opportunity to be seen through before congressional action, I applaud several of the bill's provisions. In particular, DOE should be included in recommending best practices for coordination between the two sectors because there are currently only 2 electric utility representatives on the BDAC. Communication providers should take responsible measures to integrate backup power into their networks, and emergency operations centers already exist to provide appropriate coordination during times of emergency between industry and government stakeholders. Among the voluntary efforts, the BDAC Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group is in the process of finalizing a report that will identify best practices for coordination before, during, and after a disaster. Additionally, at the request of the FCC, the Edison Electric Institute and the CTIA are establishing a cross-sector resiliency forum. With respect to HR 5926, it is crucial to acknowledge that most disasters are local, state, or regional events. Therefore, the goal should be to drive all coordination and information sharing through state or county EOCs. The unintended consequence of a federal master directory is that it could have the opposite effect. Another concern with HR 5926 is the consideration of applying the one-call notification system to fiber lines at the federal level. Rather than duplicate efforts that are already in place in most states, I would recommend assigning fiber optic cable locators to electric and debris removal crews during storm restoration and evaluating construction practices for critical communication networks to ensure fiber lines are not laid adjacent to electric poles. Southern's extensive experience with powerful storms such as Hurricane Michael demonstrate that hardening, redundancy, and preparedness are keys to improving resiliency. Our primary focus is the safe and quick restoration of power. For some electric customers, including nursing homes and hospitals, electric service restoration can be a matter of life and death. Even while undertaking these restoration efforts, we still coordinated regularly with communications providers at the EOCs. All critical infrastructure providers have a responsibility to use these existing multi-stakeholder processes to improve the resiliency of their systems. One reason for Southern Link's ability to maintain and quickly restore operational cell sites is our use of generators and fuel cells. While having an on-site generator at every site may not be feasible, wireless carriers should consider having generators at their most critical sites. Another key factor in Southern Link's use of redundant backhaul and transport links for its site. Another key, during and immediately after large-scale storm or disaster damage to communications fiber is inevitable and should be planned for in advance. In conclusion, we are committed to working with all stakeholders to strengthen infrastructure resilience and to promote safe, effective disaster response and service restoration.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. Mr. Gosner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Lotta, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Anthony Gosner. I'm the Fire Chief for the City of Santa Rosa. On behalf of Mayor Schwedhelm, Vice Mayor Fleming, and the entire City of Santa Rosa, I'd like to express my appreciation for the opportunity to appear before this committee today and discuss the vital role wireless communications and technology play in public safety and emergency situations. A little over 2 years ago, the City of Santa Rosa, the largest city in Sonoma County and the county seat, experienced what was then the worst wildfire in California's history. Beginning the night of October 8, 2017, multiple fires broke out through California's North Bay. In Sonoma County, what were initially 5 major fires merged into 3, the Tubbs, the Nums, and the Pocket Fires, collectively known as the Sonoma Complex. In a span of a few hours, life profoundly changed for tens of thousands of people in Santa Rosa and throughout Sonoma County. A total of 24 people lost their lives to the fires in Sonoma County. An estimated 100,000 people evacuated from their homes, and 43 emergency shelters opened, serving close to 4,162 people at the peak of the operations in Sonoma County. Property losses were estimated at $13 billion. More than 3,000 homes, approximately 5% of the city's housing stock, were destroyed, compounding an already severe housing deficit in the county. And for many fire survivors in our community, after losing their homes and personal possessions, lost their ability to communicate with family members, friends, doctors, and others because they lost their landline and associated phone numbers. We thank Congressman Thompson for introducing the Phone Act, which will provide a temporary hold on telephone number reassignments after a federally declared major disaster and ensure that disaster survivors go through the long and painful process of rebuilding. They will have one less thing to worry about. The City of Santa Rosa strongly supports the Phone Act and respectfully requests that this committee pass it quickly, making this critical need available to our communities this fire season and before another natural disaster strikes. We know that telecommunications infrastructure is not only vital to our residents during and after recovery, but it is also critical in how public safety officials respond to wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, and so many other disasters. The California Governor's Office of Emergency Services reported that 341 cell sites were offline during the October 2017 Northern California wildfires, and a combined 489 cell sites were offline during the Camp and Woolsey fires in November of 2018. This prevented wireless users in the impacted areas from being able to call 911, receive an emergency alert, or use their cell phones to find the safest evacuation route. Prior to and during the 2009 Cascade Fire in Sonoma County, PG&E de-energized major portions of Northern California. In Sonoma County, one quarter of the area's 436 cell phone towers were not functioning, and in nearby Marin County, more than half of the area's 280 towers were out of service due to this strategy. While wireless infrastructure cannot stop a wildfire, it can and should be hardened to withstand these impacts of similar disasters. Therefore, the city strongly supports the Wireless Infrastructure Resiliency during Emergencies and Disaster Act, the WIRED Act, sponsored by Congresswoman Ashew and co-sponsored Congressman Huffman. The bill gives the states the flexibility and authority to require wireless companies to deploy hardened infrastructure so that wireless networks are more resilient to disasters. During the Tubbs fire, roughly 70 cell towers were knocked out of service within the first several hours of the fire due to damage, loss of power, or loss of terrestrial communications. Based on our experience mandating reasonable requirements like installation of fail-safe battery backup at cell towers, increasing the number of sites with backup generators, and sufficient fuel to operate for a maximum of 72 hours, requirements for reciprocity between cell providers so that in the event of cell sites going offline during a disaster, sharing of cellular networks will hopefully be able to maintain at least a minimum level of emergency messaging support, retrofitting existing cell tower sites and enhanced vegetation management and defensible space standards near cell towers could significantly improve our response capabilities. In addition to hardening the telecommunications infrastructure, our alerting system plays a significant role in protecting people. Even as our recovery is still ongoing, the city is taking critical steps, including commissioning an after-action report to identify problems and implement solutions that will make the city more resilient in future disasters. Our plan incorporates mitigation principles into future infrastructure projects and improves alerting systems available for public notifications, alert, warning, advisories. The alerting systems now available to the city include iPause, and I won't go in detail due to lack of time, SoCo Alert, which is an opt-in system, high and low sirens, which are included on all of our police and fire apparatus, Nixle, which is an information service, and alerting and outreach campaigns, which the city has created a robust system to disseminate throughout the city. The city would like to also acknowledge that the work FEMA is doing to update iPause to implement enhancements to the WIA system and has been working closely with the city of Santa Rosa and other local governments to deploy next generation of WIA technology, which will increase the maximum character from 90 to 360 characters and support Spanish language wireless emergency alerts. Add 2 new alert categories in addition to the presidential, amber, and imminent threat, and enhanced geo-targeting, reaching 100% of the target area with more than 1/10 of a mile shoot and other improvements. For these reasons and many others that I won't get into due to time, this is why we support the Resilient Networks Act. The city of Santa Rosa is working closely with the whole community, including government, nonprofit, private sector partners, to ensure our residents and first responders, emergency managers have the proper planning equipment and personnel to prevent and respond to the next disaster. Again, thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Garst, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Walden, Ranking Member Latta, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of CTIA and the wireless industry, thank you for holding this important hearing and your long-standing leadership on public safety issues. Each member of this subcommittee has felt the impact of disaster. And in particular, I want to thank Chairman Pallone, who was instrumental in forging a framework in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. That framework has encouraged wireless providers to share resources and support each other's customers, all to maintain service and accelerate the recovery from recent disasters for millions of Americans. Today, we are stronger than we were after Sandy, and there is more we can do together to reinforce our networks, our responses, and our performance. Americans are relying on wireless services more than ever. We reach for our wireless devices to call or text 911. We use mobile apps to organize rescues, and wireless emergency alerts ring the warning bells that spur us to action. That is why wireless providers prepare, respond, and invest in resiliency. Over the last decade, the wireless industry has invested $253 billion to build redundant, diverse, and densified networks. So even if some cell sites go down, providers have fortified large coverage cell sites to support critical communications. And providers enhance and restore wireless coverage with cell sites on the backs of trucks that we call cows, and dedicated teams ready to repair networks and heal communities with chargers and a helping hand. These investments in resiliency have paid dividends. 95% of cell sites maintained service throughout Hurricane Harvey. 81% of cell sites withstood the intensity of Hurricane Michael. 96% of cell sites were online while millions of Californians were without power last year. And just last month, 68% of cell sites withstood a 6.4 magnitude earthquake that knocked out power across Puerto Rico. Now, these numbers do not diminish the challenges in the hardest hit areas. And wireless providers have applied lessons learned, like burying fiber to avoid damage during hurricane recovery efforts in Florida, hardening towers and cell sites to withstand high winds in Puerto Rico, elevating equipment to avoid flooding in Texas, and diversifying backup power solutions with cabinet-sized batteries and truck-sized generators in California. The investments that wireless providers make in time, material, and people to prepare and respond to wildly diverse emergencies have made our networks and our nation stronger. But coordination and communication are also essential to rapidly respond and restore services. In light of recent experiences in Florida and California, wireless providers and electric utilities are taking steps to enhance coordination. Today, I'm pleased to announce that CTIA and the Edison Electric Institute recently agreed to convene our member companies to identify near-term actions that can improve information sharing and preparedness. We will focus on lessons learned over the last year of hurricane and wildfire events, and we will keep this subcommittee apprised of our progress. Now, even as our networks are getting stronger, storms and disaster events are too. This subcommittee is right to ask what more can be done to enhance wireless services during emergencies. We support the goals of Chairman Pallone and Representative McNerney's Resilient Networks Act. By recognizing that wireless networks are nationwide, but emergency events are local, the bill directs the FCC to set clear expectations for roaming, mutual aid, backup power, and information sharing during disasters. And we look forward to working with the subcommittee to improve the bill's focus on policies that further situational awareness among public safety stakeholders. We support Representative McNerney's READI Act, which can help ensure that wireless emergency alerts remain a trusted tool by encouraging alert originators to avoid false alerts and harness new capabilities. And we support Ranking Member Walden's First Responder Act, because state and local governments shouldn't undermine public trust and safety by diverting any of the $2.6 billion in 911 fees that they collect from wireless consumers every year. We also support this subcommittee's effort to make it easier to access the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by implementing 988. Call centers need sufficient funding to help people in crisis, and we need an effective and equitable way to do that. In closing, we will continue to invest in resiliency and enhance our coordination to make our network stronger. And we will work with this subcommittee to set reasonable and flexible expectations that ensure wireless is there when Americans need it most. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Torres, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, and esteemed members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about the life and death issue of ensuring that communications networks properly serve all people in the United States, especially in times of crisis. I am the Senior Director of Strategy and Engagement at Free Press and Free Press Action. I'm here today on behalf of 1.4 million members in all 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Over the past couple of years, since Hurricanes Irma and Maria struck Puerto Rico in 2017, Free Press has worked with allies to ensure that lawmakers and regulators are crafting policies to rebuild communications in Puerto Rico and to hear directly from Puerto Ricans impacted by the disaster. I am Puerto Rican, and I grew up in New York City. Like so many Puerto Ricans growing up in the States, I often traveled as a kid to the islands to visit my grandmother. 4 of my Free Press colleagues also have their personal connection to Puerto Rico. Hurricane Maria, a Category 4 storm, knocked out power and nearly the entire communications network on the islands. This impacted recovery efforts. FEMA said it struggled to gain situational awareness and assess the status of critical infrastructure, in part due to Puerto Rico's communication outages. The president of Puerto Rico's Association of Emergency Managers told the Associated Press the biggest crisis after Maria was communication, and that it unleashed an endless number of problems. Between 3,000 and 5,000 people died as a result of Maria, making it one of the worst tragedies in U.S. history. And the inability of Puerto Ricans to communicate was a factor in the death toll. My colleagues and I worked with Puerto Rican activists when we traveled to Puerto Rico in 2018 to learn how the communication collapse impacted people's lives. Residents of Vieques and Comorillo told us how the lack of communication limited their mobility, left them without knowing where to search for food, water, medical care, and how to reach loved ones or get information about mudslides. This is why a coalition of Puerto Rican groups and leaders and racial justice and public interest groups have called on the Federal Communications Commission to conduct an independent investigation into all the factors that contributed to the communication crisis. But so far, the FCC has failed to do so. In contrast, the FCC did investigate the communication disruptions in the Florida Panhandle following Hurricane Michael, also a Category 4 storm. The Commission found that the lack of coordination among wireless and landline service providers, power crews, and municipalities prolonged the restoration of service. We applauded the Commission for conducting the investigation, but we are also troubled by the disparity in treatment when it comes to Puerto Rico. We believe that the longest known communications blackout in modern U.S. history warrants an investigation. Earlier this month, in a letter to Representative Yvette Clarke, Chairman Pai praised the telecom carriers for applying the lessons they learned after Hurricane Maria to rapidly restore service in areas of Puerto Rico impacted by the recent earthquakes. But the lessons the chairman alludes to have yet to be made public. Meanwhile, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel criticized the Commission last September for not having a clear picture of how telecom companies who have received federal funding from the FCC have spent that money and for not knowing the precise status of communication facilities on the islands. She called this approach an invitation for waste. We urged the committee to use its oversight power to ask Chairman Pai to publicly share the lessons the carriers and the Commission have learned from Hurricane Maria. Puerto Ricans deserve to know the truth about what happened. They deserve a comprehensive investigation into all the factors that contributed to the communication crisis in Puerto Rico. They deserve to know the FCC's response, and they deserve to know the industry's response. Learning about what happened in Puerto Rico is critical to adopting policies to prevent this from happening again. Not just in Puerto Rico, but everywhere else in the country. The intensities of the storms and extreme weather is only increasing damage due to climate change, and hurricanes like Maria may become the norm. This is why Free Press Action is pleased that this committee is considering 8 bills that address various telecom issues such as resilience, because improving our communications networks following disaster is a matter of life and death. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. We've now concluded our openings. We're going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gosner, when your department responded to the fires in the communities you serve, what were the challenges you and other first responders faced when the communication networks went down for the people who lived there?
For us, this was a no-notice event, right? So it happened very quickly, and it impacted a large group of people in both Napa and Sonoma counties. One of the things that we tried to use was SoCo Alert, which is a wireless technology to notify our constituents out there to get out of the way. Due to the towers going down, we had up to 70 towers go down early on in the process. The system did not reach everyone, which made us, the fire department, and law enforcement, both city and sheriff, go door to door. We had to actually people out of the way. We could not really fight the fire because we were too busy moving people out of the way. There were a few instances where we had to put equipment on bigger buildings with a lot of people in it to make sure that they survived. But the majority of the crews were out hustling, trying to get people out of their houses and just trying to get them out of the way. And when you have a fire of that magnitude, by the time it hit us, it was 5 miles wide with winds 60, 70 miles an hour. It's very difficult to evacuate an area as quickly as it needs to, going door to door. So it was without the towers, without the ability to send the wireless alerts, it really hampered our ability to notify the community to tell them to get out of the way.
Yeah, we all on this committee want to thank you and your heroic first responders for what you did. It's just hard to imagine the devastation that fire brought on that community. Mr. Torres, why was it so devastating when communication services went down in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria? And what did the people lose access to? And also, given the earthquake that just hit the island, do you think the island's communication networks were any better prepared?
We would like to know whether that's true or not, because the FCC has failed to investigate what happened. We don't know whether like Commissioner Russell also said, we don't know the state of communication facilities. The fact that 31% of the wireless outages in Puerto Rico following it shows that there still needs resiliency still needs to be hardened in Puerto Rico even after Maria. But we're concerned. Even the inklings of the little breadcrumbs that the telecom carriers have said after Maria, telling to their investors there's questions whether they were going to invest. One company said they're not sure they're going to reinvest. They're going to replace wireline. They're going to give people wireless instead of replacing the wireline. So there is questions. That's the little bit of evidence we have that leaves us concerned that perhaps companies are not going to do everything they can on all different areas of Puerto Rico to restore service to the way it originally was prior to it.
Ms. Ackerson, in your testimony, you talked about why it's so important for suicide crisis call centers to have the resources they need to respond to meet the current needs and to deal with the potential influx of calls when a national 3-digit number is implemented. Can you talk about what we risk if these call centers do not have the resources to respond to the calls?
Sure, absolutely. And just by way of background, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is currently a network of about 170 local call centers scattered in states across the country. And at this time, the funding for those centers is primarily comes from state funding, or I'm sorry, county and other local funding sources. There are some states that answer the majority of their calls in state. When a call center isn't adequately equipped, those calls can be routed to one of the 6 national backup centers when a particular call center, depending on changes in volume, becomes overwhelmed. That's not ideal for a number of reasons. We like when the calls can be answered in the state in which the caller is. They have a better knowledge of the local resources, can connect them more quickly to needed services. So at this time, there are already states that are struggling to keep up with the volume. When we see an implementation with 988, we do expect to see a pretty drastic increase in the volume of calls. And the concern is that if these call centers aren't adequately funded through a more braided approach, including federal appropriations, the existing state options, giving states the authority to collect fees from local carriers and their other local sources, more and more calls will have to be answered out of state.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Latta for questions.
And again, Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for holding today's hearing. Again, thanks to our witnesses for being here. We really appreciate your testimony. And I'd like to follow up, Ms. Ackerson, if I may, on what the chairman was just talking about, because again, as I mentioned, I had Chairman Pye in my district in the last week that we were at the Rescue Mental Health and Addiction Services, which is one of the many Lifeline call centers across the country. And again, our goal is to make sure we get this deployed as rapidly as possible because as mentioned, that, when we're, once we get the implementation out there, it's likely to at least double the number of calls that we had in 2018. So we want to make sure this is done right and get it done so we can be on that front line and make sure that we're helping people and also saving lives. But if I could just follow up, as we talk about the legislation calling for that implementation deadline in 1 year, what would happen if 988 was implemented in 1 year and the call centers weren't adequately prepared to handle that influx of calls, and especially when we're looking at that massive number that could come in? And I know when I was in Toledo with the chairman, just seeing how exponentially each year it's been going up. So what would happen if we didn't have that ready to go?
And you're correct about that. The Lifeline actually experiences year-over-year increases of 50% or 15% in their calls to the Lifeline without the 988 legislation. So when we see this drastic uptick in calls, the primary concern is that the calls will go unanswered. They will have long wait times and hang up. Or if those calls go unanswered in the state in which they're located, that those will roll to one of these 6 national backup centers, which again is not ideal because those folks don't have the local knowledge of the support and resources and can't connect the caller to emergency services if needed.
Let me follow up with one more. What type of flexibility, if any, should we have out there during this transition period?
Flexibility in?
For making sure, that to make sure we can get this done correctly, and if you have to have some flexibility in the implementation.
Sure. And not being a communications expert, I do want to say that we fully support the FCC's recommendation around the timeline and encourage, we support Congress to work closely with the FCC, mental health providers, other key stakeholders, people with lived experience, and the crisis call centers themselves in coming up with an implementation plan that is thoughtful but also rapid.
Oh, thank you very much. Mr. Gertz, if I could turn to you, would you provide an update on how the FCC is expanding the voluntary wireless resiliency framework to include electric utilities and provide better coordination with 911 call matters?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Congressman. I just want to first start by acknowledging the stories we heard and the way that people rely on wireless services during an emergency. It's one of the first things you grab when an emergency happens, whether you're calling 911, whether you need to receive a wireless emergency alert, whether you're trying to connect with friends or family. And those services, 911, wireless emergency alerts, they depend on the wireless networks being there, and wireless depends on power being there to maintain its services as well. We've taken steps to make sure that we can maintain our services even in the event of significant power outages, but we need to enhance our collaboration and coordination, and that's what the FCC has been encouraging us to do. We do work with the power companies in a number of different places. As Mr. Bell said, we work in state emergency operations centers. We work at tabletop exercises in between hurricane and wildfire seasons so that we can try to enhance our coordination. And we just announced today that the Edison Electric Institute and CTIA are going to be bringing our member companies together in a different way, because we know that even with all those efforts, we've still had challenges after Hurricane Michael in California. So we do think that there is more work that can be done, and we're hopeful that this new collaborative effort, this voluntary collaborative effort, will help to enhance our capabilities.
Thank you. Mr. Bell, would you like to follow up on in my last 30 seconds on that? Oh, your mic, please.
The Disaster Recovery Group and the BDAC will be issuing a report hopefully by the end of March. We're meeting to finalize that this afternoon on ways that the two industries can work together. The communication industry has changed over the years. It used to be they were very large bundles of copper that fell on the ground, and they worked even when they were falling on the ground. And typically the electric utility would go in first, and the telephone company would follow, and we wouldn't have to be there at the same time. Today, fiber optic cable carries a whole lot more, has a whole lot more capacity than those do, and so a break in a fiber optic cable can cause a very significant problem. So the communication industry is there at the same time we are. And that's one of the issues we're working through is how do we coordinate that effort?
Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for your indulgence.
Thank the ranking member. Chair now recognizes Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and I thank the witnesses this morning. I appreciate your testimony, especially Mr. Gosner. I appreciate your work in Santa Rosa and in helping us here in our legislative process. As fire chief for the city of Santa Rosa, is wildfire season something that you are worried about only during May to October, or has it become a year-round concern?
It is definitely becoming a year-round concern. We do have wet season in Northern California, but I will tell you that our fire seasons start earlier, so a month and a half earlier, and they're lasting a month to 2 months longer. So while it's not completely year-round, when it's not active firefighting, we're preparing for the next season. So we consider it a year-round endeavor.
Well, thank you. In your written testimony, you noted the benefits of installing more fail-safe battery systems at cell towers and increasing the number of sites with backup generators. Can you expand a little bit on how this will help your first responders during emergencies?
Yeah, this allows us to communicate with all of our constituents within the city, and then that helps with constituents in the county. We work really close with Sonoma County emergency managers, so we are always trying to how do we make sure we meet our expectations, their expectations, that they are notified as quick as they can. So when you harden a tower, you're not going to be able to harden it against everything, but you can harden it to withstand a little bit of a heat threat. You can harden it to withstand some earthquake. You can harden these resources and have backup batteries or generators that when there is a power outage due to a power shut off or for whatever reason, they are up and running, and we are able to communicate to our members the needs that they are going to have to take. Or the actions that they're going to have to take. On a no-notice fire where it takes out numerous cell towers, you can't get the message out, and it's deadly, right? So it's one thing, I'll tell you, we had the Kincaid fire in 2019, but we had notice of that fire, and we were able to evacuate the city of Hillsburg, the city of the town of Windsor, and a large portion of Sonoma County because we had the ability and time to do it, and we had the resources to do it. Back in 2017, we just didn't because there was too many cell towers that were down.
Thank you. Mr. Gerst, during the wildfire season this past fall, there were hundreds of cell towers that went down. In Contra Costa County, which is part of my district, we lost 88 cell towers. Since that time, when the wildfires took place, what additional investments have members made in backup power capabilities?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And first, again, thank you for your leadership on the Resilient Networks Act and the READI Act. And I want to acknowledge the challenges that your constituents probably faced in the last power down issues in California, and we are committed to doing better. Two of the ways that we're going to do that is by enhancing our coordination and collaboration with the electric utilities. That is the main reason for our announcement today with the Edison Electric Institute. We have to do something differently there. The second thing we're going to do is evaluating our backup power capabilities. We have hundreds of thousands of cell sites throughout the country. We have thousands of cell sites, as you noted, throughout California. Each one of them, we have to look at a case-by-case basis of what backup power solutions we can have available to us. We're talking about different types of battery sizes, right? We're not talking about the batteries you can go to CVS and get. We're talking about cabinet-sized batteries. We're talking about truck-sized generators. And those all come with different challenges in how we deploy them, but we were committed to looking at existing cell sites, new cell sites, and diversifying those solutions, because if this is going to be the new normal, we need to maintain service.
Well, good. The Resilient Networks Act would ensure that we have the necessary backup power during times of emergency, and I hope we can move quickly on this piece of legislation. Mr. Gosner, again, in your written testimony, you note that when it comes to targeting a WEA alert, knowing where the cell towers are located is critical. Did the city of Santa Rosa have access to information about cell tower locations during recent wildfires?
We have general information, so we don't, when I say that, we did some testing, and if you have I'll just use Verizon and AT&T handset, one might go off and the other one won't because we're hitting a certain tower in that geofencing. What we really need is where are those towers and how, during an emergency, those towers need to cross-communicate so they hit everyone, not based on your carrier, but based on the emergency. And so that's the geofencing wall. It's very big right now, and they're going to tighten it down. When I say big, it spills over a great deal and notifies communities that aren't even near the impacted area when you try to target it. So the geo-targeting is great as long as all of the cell towers are within the system working as they're supposed to, and they communicate with each other in time of need. We can't have one cell tower activated and the other one not because of your carrier. It's an emergency. Everyone, and it's a touristy area too. So you got people from other areas.
I go there.
Yeah.
So at any rate, Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I'd like to present a letter for the record from PG&E about the Resilient Act.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes my good friend from Houston, Mr. Olson. 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome to our 6 experts. Texas 22 is the southwest suburbs of Houston, Texas. Right now, we have 1 million people in Texas 22. That makes it the largest congressional district in America. And that growth means problems when a disaster hits like a hurricane. We have many monikers about my home area. It's the home of the Imperial Sugar Company. It's called the energy capital of the world. It's called Space City, USA. And it's also called part of Hurricane Alley. And we will get hit by a hurricane. Again, it's not a matter of if, but when. We've suffered the worst natural disaster in our country's history, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. 12,000 people killed with no chance to know what's coming their way. We had Hurricane Carla in 1961, the most intense Gulf hurricane ever. We had Hurricane Alicia in 1983, wiped out the Texas Medical Center. We had Hurricane Ike in 2008, which rebounded. The storm surge came back down Galveston Bay to Galveston on the backside. And as y'all know, we had Harvey hit us twice in 2017. A working communication network saves lives during disasters. The system during Harvey was much better than during Hurricane Ike. We had real-time information about tornadoes that popped up, about roads that were impassable, about routes to get away from your home that may be flooded, where gas stations were open, grocery stores were open. That information saved lives. So my question is for you, Mr. Gerst, if you want to add in Mr. Henry, is I support a robust disaster information reporting system for carriers, broadcasters, and cable providers so they can report their operational status during these emergencies. But currently, the system is voluntary, and certain information is kept confidential. Why is that the case for the communication industry in particular?
Congressman, thank you very much for the question and acknowledging the challenges that increasing severity and intensity of these storms are going to present, particularly for your area. We were actually very proud of the experience of Hurricane Harvey in terms of the availability of services. 96% of cell sites were up, 300 wireless emergency alerts, 96,000 911 calls made, people organizing themselves for rescues. In other emergencies, in all emergencies, it's important for first responders and public safety stakeholders to have information about the status of communication networks so that they can better prioritize where their resources are going to go. That data about cell tower information, though, is both competitively sensitive and potentially a national security threat in terms of how it's exposed. We are committed to working with the FCC, with this committee, with stakeholders to identify ways to expand access to that information in a way that can protect that information. Just tomorrow, we expect that the FCC is going to be opening up a new proceeding that will be talking about that exact issue, and we look forward to a robust record developing there, and we think that there will be some new information gained by engaging with stakeholders there, but we are absolutely committed to enhancing information sharing with public safety stakeholders.
Thank you. Mr. Henry, any comments on the question, sir?
Yes, and first, thank you for the question and for the opportunity to discuss this. We share sentiments with CTIA on this, that we really do need a more robust information flow going to and from public safety. I think the only thing that I'd like to add on to this, and Houston is the perfect example. 911 is public safety, and public safety is, at the end of the day, Homeland Security.
Yep.
And public safety can be trusted with this information, whether it be competitively sensitive or sensitive in the sense of national security. When the threat to national security is a city being wiped out by a natural disaster, that's as much of a concern as anything else. Public safety has established standards and practices for dealing with sensitive information. We do it every day, and don't have any sort of hesitation about being able to keep that visible to only eyes that need it.
I do have to thank your industry for what you did during Hurricane Harvey, because I was there for Hurricane Ike, and people didn't have information. They got in the roads when they should not have. Probably 50 people died, and that's the big standard deaths in terms of how well we're doing. And Brazoria County, right there on the Gulf of Mexico, had 0 deaths during Hurricane Harvey. And the entire county is basically flooded from the Gulf halfway up to Pearland, Texas. So thank you for making that happen. A big transition, and this is for you, Mrs. Atkerson. Back home, my church, I'm involved with a small Bible study group that gets together every Monday after the weekly service to just talk about this service and lessons learned. This past week is a very different meeting. We spent the entire hour, bumped up to an hour and a half, talking about a very tragic situation. One of our members, she works at a local store down there in Sugar Land. A coworker lost a son to suicide this past week. She lost a second son to suicide a few years ago. And I cannot believe the pain she's going through. And my question is, I support this bill that gets 988 going, because we don't know if these boys could have a number to call when they're in their crisis. Can they reach out? Could they? What happened? We'll never know. But any advice I can tell her from you, what's going to happen with this system and how she can utilize it to make sure this never happens again, that these kids who are about to think the ultimate thing to do to take their own lives have a vehicle to vent and get some help to stop those suicidal thoughts?
Yes, absolutely, and I'm very sorry to hear about the loss in your community. This is obviously a very difficult topic. Just one suicide death is estimated to affect at least 6 other people or more, and so we see a tremendous ripple effect, and the numbers just continue to increase, as you all know, year after year in this country. It's a tragedy. One of the challenges has been that there hasn't been a comparable system to what we have for medical emergencies. We don't have an easy, most of us can't remember a time when we just didn't have 911 available to us, no matter where we are in this country, to rapidly access medical care. Sadly, the same kind of 3-digit rapid response has not been available for people in a mental health crisis. And as you are saying firsthand, as people in a suicidal or mental health crisis, it can be just as life-threatening as a stroke or a heart attack. So transitioning the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline from a difficult-to-remember 10-digit hotline that still many, many people in this country don't have memorized, or just imagine how difficult it is to try to think about what that number is. If you're a mother with a child that's suicidal, trying to remember a 10-digit number versus 911 or 988. So what I can say is, going forward, the urgency, this is a moral imperative for us to pass this legislation so that 988 can be easily recognizable and accessible to all of our kids, family members, parents, to anyone in this country anytime.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields
Thank you for
back.
indulgence. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member for this very enlightening hearing today. I want to thank our witnesses for bringing your expert testimony to bear. This is an extremely important hearing today. As a New Yorker, I can reflect on my experiences in the aftermath of both the 9/11 terrorist attack and years later Superstorm Sandy to refresh my memory on how important network resiliency is to my constituents and to all Americans. Today I want to first discuss the Americans who the Trump administration has too often treated with disdain and overlooked, the citizens in Puerto Rico. They have experienced a series of natural disasters that have become more frequent and more severe due to climate change. To echo Mr. Torres's statements in his written statement, quote, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but tragically their voices have been largely absent from this crucial debate, and the restoration and rebuilding processes have suffered as a result, end quote. The earthquakes that rocked Puerto Rico left the territory without power and led to 31.7% of cell sites down and left approximately 260,000 cable and wireline subscribers without service. My colleagues, Congressman Ruiz Soto and I, led a letter to the FCC to raise concern about the fragility of the communication infrastructure on the island. So my first question is actually to you, Mr. Torres. The FCC is supposed to measure whether broadband is being deployed in a timely fashion across the United States, and it's supposed to know when and where the networks go out in times of disaster. Can you discuss how the lack of real-time information on the network outages impacted people on the islands and their loved ones in the rest of the United States trying to reach them?
Sure. I'll give you two examples. One is the most recent example, the earthquakes. There was a person, a well-known activist, tweeting, can anyone, on Twitter, because she didn't have communications, she didn't have a mobile, or can anyone let me know if there's a tsunami coming? Because they weren't aware whether there was a tsunami warning, because there was a lot of fear in Puerto Rico that a tsunami potentially was going to happen. The second example I give is from the public safety workshop that the FCC held a couple of years ago after Maria and the hurricane season 2017. And so this is a regional emergency communications coordinator for FEMA, who said testifying to the FCC at a hearing, at a workshop, the voluntary word needs to go when it comes to like wires of resiliency. We have a commercial entities selling themselves as public safety grade. If you're going to make a profit saying you are serving the community with public safety grade communications, then you need to be able to prepare an answer in response as to where your communications are available. The point was being made at that workshop that they're not getting information fast enough from the FCC. And because of issue of is voluntary, is proprietary, they're saying by the time we get information, especially in the case of Puerto Rico, it was already out. They were sending people to places to repair cell sites and all that, and they were already repaired in some cases. So they didn't. It was a wasting time to be able to serve other places. So we have examples of people on the ground worried about tsunami warnings. We have a FEMA official concerned too. They're not getting real-time data fast enough. So Puerto Ricans needed, and everywhere else needs data, information much more quickly, first responders.
So can the FCC do more to gather and disseminate information about communication network reliability during and immediately after such storms?
Say that one more time.
Yeah, I'm saying, can the FCC do more to gather?
Absolutely, they can. I mean, first of all, like we don't believe there should be voluntary, right? It should be mandatory that they participate, and also the wireless resiliency framework, like it's voluntary, and we don't believe it should be voluntary. We need to be more rigorous oversight over these companies because they have to be held. Folks have to be held accountable for not responding. It's a life and death issue. So, like this gentleman said the FEMA official that it can be voluntary. There has to be some sort of process of accountability.
Very well, Mr. Gerst, would you want to respond to that?
Sure. First, let me start by saying, Congressman, thank you for the question. Maria was a devastating event for everyone. Our companies had to go to unprecedented lengths to restore services there. In fact, one of our member companies had their generator actually powering the airport at one point just to get supplies into Puerto Rico. But we have invested in Puerto Rico, and I think the results show that we've moved from wood poles to steel poles. We've invested in backup power, and after the earthquake, 68% of cell sites were up. I know there's a close relationship between first responders in New York and Puerto Rico, and in fact, I've talked to a few who say that after the earthquake, nothing worked in Puerto Rico except the wireless service. So it wasn't everywhere, and we need to do more, but we have learned lessons and applied them in Puerto Rico.
Mr.
General
Chairman, I
Lady's
yield
time has
back.
expired. Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bell, you know, while ensuring network resiliency is certainly an important overarching goal, I want to be sure that the electric and communications industries aren't faced with one-size-fits-all requirements that fail to consider the realities on the ground. Can you walk us through how your industry engages with state emergency operations centers during emergencies and how that coordination could inform priorities for restoration efforts? For example, how the fact that it's harvest time in one area or geographical factors in a particular area where an outage might come into play factor into prioritization?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. It's actually our primary contact at the Emergency Operations Center is a member of my staff, and as soon as the center opens up, he goes over there and is there, you know, for the duration of the storm, working on shifts as we can. And there's where the communication takes place. We get priorities from things that we may not be aware of and to go through them. In some cases, there was an example in Hurricane Michael where we actually got a call from the Florida Emergency Operations Center that an ILEC in Florida thought there was a hold on a pole in Georgia put on by the Georgia DOT. And so it was just a whole cascade of events that someone on the ground could not figure out, how do I find out if I can go ahead and proceed with this? Mm-hmm. All the people are right there in the Emergency Operations Center are able to determine, no, everything's clear with that. You can keep going and get the people back to work in the field. So it's, and in Hurricane Michael as well, one of the critical issues is not something you would normally think of. It was actually a peanut harvest time. And a lot of the damage that came through Georgia came through one of the largest areas we grow peanuts. And so a lot of the focus was to get the infrastructure back in place so those peanuts could be processed while still working on the rest of the storm and making sure all the other critical infrastructure is being done. So
it's a pretty real-time dynamic kind of.
It's absolutely real-time.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Gerst, you referenced many of the mobile cell units in your testimony, from CALs or cells on wheels to Colts or cells on light trucks. I'm curious if there are regulatory obstacles that make it difficult to move those assets from region to region or state to state.
Congressman, thank you for the question. Yes, we have many tools at our disposal that we attempt to use to maintain service, and these are things that we've used at applying lessons learned from previous storms. And some of the things we've incorporated into our cooperative framework, including things like mutual aid, where we will actually repair each other's cell sites, and coordinating with local governments. But yes, we have where we do have outages, we have the ability to bring in temporary cell sites, and we actually call them a barnyard of solutions because they're cells on the backs of trucks, but we call them cows and colts and goats. But we're starting to actually even use drones now, where you can add coverage where where a cell site might have gone down and call it a flying
Are there
cow.
government regulations that make it difficult for you to do that kind of move from region to region and state to state, though?
Thank you, Congressman. There are challenges, but we are engaged with the State Emergency Operations Center, and typically we can address those issues and get those resources in those areas. Certainly the Sandy Act helped by making sure that communications were prioritized as being part of that effort. So yes, there are challenges, but we're working with local governments on that.
Okay. Ensuring previously established procedures in coordination amongst wireless providers, backhaul providers, and power companies before a disaster strikes is critical to effective restoration efforts when power and communication systems go down. The FCC's Disaster Response and Recovery Group is currently looking at these types of issues and hopes to submit best practices recommendations to the FCC soon. So, Mr. Bell, Can you talk a bit about this group, its work, and its importance?
Yes, and I will commend Commissioner Pye for establishing the BDAC. It's a much better way for us to resolve issues like this. The old way was they would put out a request for comment, you would submit your comments and hope that somebody actually read them and try and advocate on them. Here,
Because my time is running out.
Okay.
Can you add to your answer? Would it be prudent for Congress to review this group's recommendations for best practices before contemplating
Absolutely.
legislative action?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Vesey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Mr. Gosner a question. In Texas, we've had some issues with wildfires in the past as well, and I know that was something that has been in the news a lot around California, particularly your area. And I wanted to know what you thought about the access to batteries. I know that, for instance, cell phone companies that are trying to replenish batteries that only can last a few hours can have trouble getting to certain areas if they're in evac zones or if certain roads have been blocked off or cut off. What sort of lessons should we learn about being able to have access to those areas in the time of wildfires? Is there anything differently that can be done as far as being able to give them the access that they need to so people can have their cell coverage restored in a more faster fashion?
Yeah, thank you. I think, part of it is they have to understand the environment they're going into. So I don't know who they're talking to. From our perspective, if we need to get power back up into a certain area and we can allow them, we will. Sometimes we send a crew with them to make sure it's safe. Sometimes their crew doesn't want to go into it because they don't feel safe. So there's multiple factors that drive why some towers get back up and some don't. But those are all real discussions we have to have now and figure that out. So when we entertain these ideas in the future, we can work through the process quickly and figure out, is this a critical tower or is it not a critical tower? If it's a critical tower, we got to make every effort to get those up and running so we can provide the communication and then build out from there. But there's multiple reasons why crews can or cannot go in on both sides of the fence. So it's literally face-to-face, sitting down, how do we work through this?
Right, exactly. One of the things that I read about the California incidents that interested me was, obviously the use of internet. And I was reading that the internet landlines almost all, a lot of them mostly failed, but that the traditional-based copper landlines did not fail. Do you think that there needs to be some sort of a, just to maybe sort of make people think about using more traditional products that live in these more rural areas that are hard to reach where they may be more affected by wildfires? I know that we're very reliant, obviously, upon the newest technology, but do you think under these sorts of circumstances that maybe until a lot of these problems can be addressed that we need to maybe look back at more traditional landline products?
Yeah, traditional landlines do last longer than the voice over internet protocol type lines. They're not fail safe, but they do last longer. What I'm being told today is that they're trying to transition out of copper altogether because the wireless technology and the cable, the fiber optics is so much more powerful and better.
Right.
So they're trailing away from the copper. Copper doesn't need power to maintain that connectivity where everything else does. So I will tell you in Sonoma County, I'm going to get these numbers a little bit wrong, but Sonoma County 10 years ago, there was 350,000 people that had copper lines. Today it's about 170,000 because everyone's making the transition to wireless. That's another reason why these towers need to be hardened. Everything needs to be to that standard where we can rely on these components much more than we can now.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. What about as far as translation for people that live in these areas? Obviously, things need to be, especially in a state like Texas or even California, obviously things would need to be translated into Spanish, for instance. Is there sufficient information out there as far as translation is concerned? Do you feel that's being adequately addressed?
It's being addressed. I don't know if I would say it's adequately being addressed. I will tell you that with 2.0 and 3.0 addresses that. So the 360 characters also adds translation for Spanish, where the initial WIA product did not, right? 90 characters and there was no Spanish translation. So they're working towards that. But again, it's a process and it's a slow process.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Brooks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this important hearing. When I first came to Congress, I was co-chair, or I was chair of the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications, and just want to thank all of you for your work, because I think we all know that in a time of disaster, this supercomputer we hold is often kind of our only lifeline, and it's so important that we figure out how to make sure that we're as resilient as possible in times of disaster. Mr. Gerst, I'm co-chair of the 5G caucus, and so I want to ask a little bit about 5G as the country is transitioning to the next generation of technology, what this transition means for the resiliency of wireless networks, and clearly there's a different architecture. Companies are deploying these small cells, naturally densifying networks, having actually maybe a lot more. Can you tell me how this important conversion, what resiliency is going to be impacted by the rollout of 5G across the country?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Thank you for your question, and thank you for your leadership on 5G issues. Making sure that the U.S. is the global leader in 5G is a priority for everyone, I know, including you. 5G is going to bring incredible opportunities, the high capacity, low latency capabilities, particularly for public safety. Public safety can use those capabilities actually in the field for new innovations that Mr. Henry could probably talk to you about. But from our perspective, we need hundreds of thousands of new cell sites to make that happen, to get to that level of service for 5G. And the way that we build networks now is we do build them in redundant, diverse, and densified ways. So even if some cell sites go down, we do try to maintain coverage and for emergency communications. By adding hundreds of thousands of new cell sites that 5G is going to bring, we absolutely believe it will help to improve resiliency. And we think that the Resilient Networks Act is a forward-looking bill. It talks about 5G and how it might improve resiliency, and we appreciate that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on 5G, resiliency, or capabilities? Okay, I'll move on then. Mr. Henry, how does the practice of diverting 911 fees affect the ability to ensure 911 systems keep pace with technological changes and the ability to engage in effective long-term planning? Because we need to ensure that 911 services obviously provide the best emergency services possible. So can you talk to us a bit more about, you talked about the number of states that we know that do divert, and yet, the practice that our states have to maintain to make sure that communities aren't diverting.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I guess top line, 911 fee diversion hurts not just the public, but it also hurts public safety. It hurts in the sense that the folks making budget decisions about 911 are often not the people operating the PSAPs, and they're not the people that are directing a state's 911 budget planning and policies. One of the big effects that we've seen over the decade or so, the FCC has been keeping records on these things, is that diversion often happens in sort of fits and spurts. And so the 911 authority in a state, or the 911 governance structure in a state, may be surprised by a diversion of funds from the top of the state level. And so the aggregate effect of that is that you've always got to prepare for a budgetary tornado to come through and wipe out a good chunk of your funding for 911. You get into a damage control mode instead of a continuous improvement and a continuous innovation mode where you're preparing for the next thing. You're constantly instead preparing for the next disaster, whether that be a literal disaster or a budgetary disaster.
What percentage would you say of the 911 capabilities now are text capabilities? I know our state has texting capabilities in 911. Is that very common now in many of the other states?
I wouldn't say very common, probably 30 to 40% coverage. And of course, the difficulty with that is that you don't find out that you can't text 911
Right.
So you find out you can't text 911.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just want to mention in response to our colleague Ms. Clark's question about the FCC doing more to garner or to gather and disseminate data during disasters. The FCC is planning on acting tomorrow on a second further notice proposed rulemaking to do just that. I've been informed by staff. Just thought I would share that we should look for further proposed rulemaking tomorrow. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Eshu for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony. If I were to summarize all the various things that have been said, there are two things that stand out. What kind of system we have and how much more we need to do to optimize the system that we have. And when there are cracks in the system, people's lives are at stake. I want to read two of many messages I received from constituents during the PG&E shutoffs last October, which resulted, of course, in the loss of cellular communications. A family from a rural area of my district. Yes, Silicon Valley does have some very beautiful rural areas. Quote, when PG&E cuts the power off, those of us who live in rural areas are not only left without electricity, we're left without communications. Cell phones don't work. Landlines don't work. Generators don't keep the Wi-Fi on. Why are we being left out to dry? We have no way to call 911 in an emergency and no way to get alerts if there's danger and we need to evacuate. Another constituent wrote, during the second, more recent outage, we had broadband and phone for only 15 hours. It then failed, leaving us with no means of communication. That's a scary term. No means of communication in the United States of America. This is a serious safety concern. This is not just an annoyance. If there were to be a fire in our highly vulnerable tinder dry area, we wouldn't be able to report it, wasting precious time while it spreads. The same is true if there were any sort of medical emergency. So these people are understandably, A, they're vulnerable, B, they're afraid, and they're justifiably upset, and so am I. So we have to help them. Chief Gosner, I want to salute you, as others have, for your absolutely superb leadership. You, your department, and the people of Sonoma County and Santa Rosa have been through actual hell. Lives lost, devastation, homes lost, hope lost. And when I went up to visit and to hear from the entire team, it will always remain with me. Grown men weeping, and these were first responders who were going door to door to try and save people's lives because they had no communication system whatsoever. Now, we have a problem in, it's an ambiguity, actually, in federal law relative to what states can and cannot do. And I thank you for your support of the Wired Act. It's very important. Mr. Gerst, I know that CTIA doesn't have any position on this, but I ask you to really take a hard look at the legislation. And the reason I'm asking you to is rather obvious. You use the word resiliency. I tried counting and then I lost count. But that's an operational word. And if states cannot have a say in setting resiliency, sometimes it happens, a lot of times it doesn't. And we have to clear the weeds out of this. States should have a hand in that. And really, that's what the legislation does. So I appreciate the work that CTIA is doing. Mr. Torres, you gave beautiful and profoundly sad testimony. What I'd like to ask you is, if there's one thing that you want us to do, what is it?
Is for this committee to use its oversight powers.
But for what? What item is the top thing for you being at the bench
Us
today?
advocating in Puerto, a couple of things. One, for advocating Puerto Rico, just we want to know why. So just if we
Well,
know what
I
happened.
think that there should be a letter circulated to all members
Yep.
of this subcommittee, signed by everyone on a bipartisan basis, to make sure that what's needed there and the assessment that's not public be made public.
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, the fact that it's been mentioned here already, I believe it's 60% of households are wireless only, and it's only going up, right? But yet, according to GAO, the length of outages from 2009 2016 has doubled when it comes to wireless, right? And so the fact that this is a growing problem, and so it's the fact that is DERS, right, to make sure it's mandatory, but also the wireless resiliency framework. We don't believe it should be voluntary. And so there has to be oversight to make sure that that first responders, first of all, that the networks are resilient, but then first responders are actually, and other folks are able to respond to disasters. So it should not be voluntary.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's
Thank you, Mr.
time has
Chairman.
expired. Thank you. Mr. Walden, welcome back. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I was downstairs at the other hearing. So I appreciate all your testimony and the comments, and I know you've covered most of the ground. I think back on my own experience in small market radio and covering fires and seeing some of these disasters. And, you know, I had 5 transmitters. I had 3 antenna sites. I had some that were under threat of fire. They were up on top of a ridge top. And I'm trying to be balanced here in saying, how do we mandate a resilient network in the face of a conflagration like tragedy you had to deal with in Santa Rosa? I drove through there, and I mean, it's just it's unbelievable in Paradise, those areas, as we see the video. And so I want to be thoughtful about this. I know as a broadcaster, we had all these interconnections. I mean, we had radio connections to our law enforcement. We could talk, we could listen to each other. That was one of our EAS stations. We had backup on that. But sometimes when these disasters happen, there's no, I mean, you're just done, right? I mean, you rely on ham radio operators, you create your own networks. But I'm just curious with some of the voluntary work a couple of you talked about. Can you speak to that a little bit more, the things you've just announced in the last, today, maybe even? Mr. Gerst, Mr. Bell?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman and Ranking Member. Thank you for the question, and I appreciate your vast experience on these issues. You know, with the increasing severity and intensity of these storm events, we are constantly having to reevaluate how we make our networks resilient. And we have, since Superstorm Sandy, through the cooperative framework, taken significant steps working amongst competitive wireless providers, enabling them to support each other's customers, enhancing our collaboration with utilities. So yes, we are doing all these things on a voluntary basis, but even with all those things, we do think new tools could be helpful here. And so we'd like to explore that. Well, we think, certainly, having the FCC set expectations at a national level, both for wireless and including the power industry would be helpful, because one of the things we've learned with the framework, with all these voluntary commitments, is that a lot of the folks at the local level, and you may have experienced this, bring their own expectations to what you're supposed to be doing in an emergency. And by having a national framework around what we're supposed to be doing could help make sure that everybody knows what wireless providers are supposed to do, what electric providers are supposed to do, and that could help to enhance our resiliency while still giving us the flexibility to work at the local level.
All right. Mr. Bell?
Currently in FEMA, there are the emergency support functions, each one, and if you were to look up or Google, best practices in disaster recovery, you would find volumes of information of best practices that are out there. I think what we need to improve on is the communication industry has their volumes and the electric industry has their volumes, and as the two industries get more and more intertwined, there has to be a whole lot more communication between the two. And I think that's what this will provide the opportunity to do, is to start making sure that
You're talking to each other and have a common plan.
Absolutely. We're not working in silos.
Yeah, that's important. I know I've heard over the years there were some people that thought you had to have a generator and a propane tank at every cell site. Is that practical?
It's not practical, but I will tell you that.
Should we mandate it?
We're one of the few utilities in the country that actually has our own telecom provider, and it's for that very reason. We want to be able to know that they'll be there when we have a problem, and they proved their worth in Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Michael. We were able to use them throughout the storm, and they do have backup generators.
At every site?
It's expensive, yes.
Well,
Mr. Gerst?
Sure, Congressman. Backup power is a great tool in the toolbox for resiliency. But we have hundreds of thousands of cell sites that we have to look at on an individual case-by-case basis. We've got huge boomer towers out there just like yours, and we've got towers and antennas on the sides of buildings, and we're going to need hundreds of thousands of more sites for 5G that's going to be coming. And each one of those cell sites, we have to consider what the backup power solution is going to be because we are so dependent on power. And that include, these are batteries that are the size of cabinets, generators are the size of trucks, right? And we have to consider space, noise, local regulations and air quality requirements, even the type of fuel that we're using, because we sure don't want to have the type of fuel that would be, caught up in a fire.
Right.
So it is a big challenge, but a reasonable and flexible approach we think could be helpful here.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a good job.
Chair recognizes Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today for this very important hearing. The Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has an obligation to assist state and local governments to prepare for, respond to, and learn from disasters. However, the agency's response to significant emergencies has been inconsistent. As the number and severity of natural disasters increases, it is critical that the FCC responds adequately and swiftly. My Emergency Reporting Act would require the FCC to standardize its emergency response by conducting field hearings, issuing reports, and making policy recommendations whenever disasters strike. Our current approach of relying on members of Congress to call on the FCC to act is no longer sustainable. We need to set a baseline level of responsiveness to ensure local officials have the support they need to secure our communications networks in the face of rapidly changing climate. Mr. Torres, can you describe the shortcomings of the FCC's existing emergency reporting structure and how standardizing the agency's emergency response approach might improve network resiliency?
Yeah, as I mentioned already before, that there isn't, when an example came to Puerto Rico, it wasn't coming fast enough. The information that the first responders needed didn't come fast enough. And, and it is critically important because as I failed to mention when the Congresswoman Eshu was here, that currently the FCC, there is no, they have no measurements. Wise Resiliency Network doesn't have any way to measure the metrics of whether the framework is actually even working.
Absolutely. Well, when conducting field hearings, my bill requires the FCC to not only consider consulting public safety experts, like academics and industry representatives, but also individuals affected by the emergency. Why is this perspective necessary to truly understand the full impact of the disaster?
It's important to hear from people on the ground because you get a perspective on what the needs are of everyday people, particularly as more folks are wireless only. It is a sense of urgency that's needed in order to respond to disasters that are happening all the time.
Right.
And more importantly, it's going to inform it's going to help to inform policies that go forward. It's critical. It's critical that we have field hearings.
Okay, my Emergency Reporting Act would also require the FCC to initiate a rulemaking to develop improved standards for requiring communication network operators to notify 911 centers when they are experiencing outages that prevent consumers from completing 911 calls, or when emergency calls do not include vital information like location or number data. Mr. Henry, have you heard of instances in which consumers' 911 calls did not include location or number data, and what challenges do 911 centers face in dispatching help in these cases?
Sure, and thank you for the question. Outages or outages in either Annie or Allie in location or phone number delivery to the PSAP are common enough that you can speak to almost any telecommunicator and they'll tell you about an experience
Okay.
with that, where there's no callback number or there's no location. If there's no location, then the call taker must hope that the person calling 911 is able to communicate verbally their location, which means that they both have to know their location and they have to be able to speak.
Okay. And Chief Gosner, I imagine the Santa Rosa Fire Department experienced situations in which limited information from a resident's 911 call has prevented an effective response. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. While the FCC has notification obligations for network outages, the threshold remains high, and 911 centers are often left in the dark about service outages in their territory, jeopardizing public safety. Mr. Henry, do you believe a more effective network outage notification threshold would help improve the flow of information to 911 centers?
Absolutely. 911 and all of public safety would benefit greatly from network outage reports that are better tailored to fit their needs.
Okay, I recently sent a letter to Chairman Pai urging him to include wildfire specific recommendations in the wireless resiliency framework. While the FCC has solicited comments on improving the framework in the context of hurricanes, Chairman Pai would not commit at our oversight hearing to doing the same for wildfires. I'm glad to see the Resilient Networks Act, introduced by Chairman Pallone and Representative McNerney, take steps to mandate elements of the framework. In addition, I believe there is an opportunity to require the FCC to finish long overdue efforts to modernize the framework, including recommendations specific to wildfires and other disasters. Mr. Torres and Chief Gosner, do you believe the wildfire-specific recommendations would help local responders better prepare for communications outages associated with wildfires? A yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Representing Michigan's Energy District, I appreciate the fact and am proud at times when I've seen Consumers Energy trucks and crews and DTE heading south and east during disaster situations to provide mutual aid, and knowing the fact that as that develops, if there ever is an emergency, a natural disaster in Michigan, which we think of as a place that's heaven all year round, great weather wherever you find it, that the industry is growing in their understanding of working together and to improve coordination. Mr. Bell, can you describe for us today some of the multi-stakeholder groups that electric utilities and communications providers participate in to develop best practices to reduce or eliminate outages?
Well, obviously, there's the BDAC. We've addressed that already. They're specifically addressing that very issue, and there are multiple stakeholders in there. In Georgia, there's a group called the Georgia Utility Coordinating Council. It's made up of all utilities, and their main focus is how utilities can best work on the right-of-way, whether it be constructability or damage prevention. And then, of course, there's Georgia 811 that is made up of multiple utilities, including both electric and communication, that is specifically focused on damage prevention, whether it be in normal construction or, in what is referred to as extraordinary circumstances when a hurricane occurs. So, and Georgia has those, as well as most states around the country have some sort of collaboration where the focus is how can the utilities work together, to have both a safe and reliable infrastructure.
And this information is passed on aggressively to other parts of the country as well?
Yes, there's a lot of sharing, best practice sharing through different organizations. The Common Ground Alliance will have a conference in a couple of weeks out in California, and most of just all the states, including Canada and Australia, will be represented out there. The very purpose is to share best practices on that type of information.
Mr. Gerst, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, Mr. Bell is right that there are places where there's best practices being developed and shared, and we rely on them extensively. But given the experiences we've had, particularly in Hurricane Michael, in that race to restore service, where we were tripping over each other trying to get power and wireless services up, or even in the recent events in California, we recognize that we need to do something a little bit different now. And that's why we've announced this effort with the Edison Electric Institute, where we're going to, for the first time, bring leaders in our member companies together. That's not something that's happened before in that way, the way that we're talking about. And we're going to try to identify some near-term actions that may yield best practices, but at least establishing those lines of communication are going to be helpful. But ultimately, we may need even further more tools. We don't yet know exactly, how those will work out, but we do expect that, making sure that we have lines of communication, that folks in the state and local level know what resources are available and it's consistent in terms of resiliency is going to be very helpful.
Mr. Gerst, I understand the FCC's rules currently prescribe an aging process for numbers that would provide a grace period for customers affected by wildfires or other disasters. Rather than drastically reinvent the system under the Phone Act, are there ways that the FCC could modify its existing rules that would make sure that residential subscribers who have been displaced by natural disaster would not lose their landline telephone numbers that was assigned to them?
Congressman, thank you for the question, because in an emergency, we know that people reach for their wireless device, and that's the first thing one of the first things they grab when they leave their house to evacuate. And the benefits of mobile wireless is that they can take both their service and their telephone number with them. So this isn't really an issue affecting the wireless industry or wireless consumers. The FCC has very robust policies in place to make sure we don't exhaust the pool of telephone numbers that we have and how we allocate them, and also enables competition by making sure that folks aren't hoarding numbers in a way. So this is something that we'd be happy to work on and work with your office on.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When Hurricane Michael hit Florida, that very next day I had contacted one of my colleagues, Congressman Dunn, who represents the Big Bend area, via text to assure him that our staff would help him with any casework that would come up because his office was inundated. He received that text about 3 months later, unfortunately, and we were able to get a hold of him because of a satellite phone a few days later, but it shows that cell phone service can interrupt just basic interactions between offices as we're dealing with these issues. In Puerto Rico, it was even worse after Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. We had mayors given sat phones that didn't work. They were required to fill out applications on the internet for FEMA relief and had no internet. And it went on for months and months. It was just dumbfounding that that could still happen nowadays. But it really alerted me to the fact that we have a resiliency issue that we need to work together on to fix. I wanted to start with Mr. Gerst and Mr. Torres. Issues like are addressed in the Wired Act and the READI Act. Will those help us avoid situations of breakdowns like we saw in Puerto Rico and in Florida with regard to cell phone service or communications? And I'll start with you, Mr. Gerson, and go to Mr. Torres.
Congressman, thank you for the question. The events of Hurricane Maria were devastating for everyone. As I noted before, our member companies had to go to considerable lengths just to restore services. It took months to get back to some level of normalcy. It took some of our member companies working directly with the local governments to try to get resources in. In fact, at one point, one of our member companies' generators was powering the airport to actually just get supplies into the island. We do think that our member companies have invested in Puerto Rico to make it stronger, and that was evidenced last month when the earthquake hit, knocking out power across the island. 68% of the cell sites stood up. And the reason they were up is because we were invested in steel poles and we were invested in diverse backup power solutions. So we do think that there is more that we can do to try to work together to invest in both Puerto Rico and to address some of the challenges we saw in Hurricane Michael, where we were all racing to try to restore service between utilities and wireless, and we need to enhance our coordination capability. One of the things that we appreciate about the Resilient Networks Act is that it does focus on collaboration as one of its primary goals. to try to bring the stakeholders together at the national level. And so we do think that that could be very helpful.
And we do understand it's not your burden to bear alone, which is why we have these bills together to try to help out. Mr. Torres, it'd be great to hear from you about how critical the Wired Act, the READI Act, and other legislation before us is to help
we support
prevent it.
we support both acts. We believe they will help. We also support the Resiliency Act. But for us, it has to be more. More needs to be done. As I mentioned before, the wireless framework is only a couple of years old, right? And it's voluntary. We already have folks on FEMA testifying that it's too slow. And so what we need, and as I mentioned in my testimony with Puerto Rico, we need to know what happened. I'm hearing the CTIA saying the improvements they've made. We don't know if the improvements were made. We don't know. We have to take it from the word of industry. We don't have any official government report. So we need reporting to know what happened, to make sure that, as Commissioner Rosen also said, is the money being spent to address the actual situations?
And I think the reporting's very important, and I think you'll get a lot of common ground. I wanted to turn to Mr. Bell, our neighbors to the north in Georgia, which you rarely probably hear. What gaps did you see when Hurricane Michael both hit our state and your state, and what can we do to help?
I think it's the first time we realized, or the first major storm we had where communication and the electric industry were as intertwined as they are. There was a lot of confusion at the beginning about fiber cuts, and that's because on a normal storm, a Category 1 storm, it is electric tree crews that are out there clearing the trees and the debris. But when you have a storm the magnitude of Michael, it's not us. It's local government and the DOT that's clearing the roads. And so the assumption was the electric utilities are cutting fiber, and that wasn't the case. And then no one was talking to the DOT and the local governments about any critical fiber. There was a communication between the electric and the communication. So it is something that I think we all learn from that and will use moving forward for sure.
Great, thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Bilirakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Gerst, there's an increasing prevalent problem with the use of contraband cell phones in prisons with intent to commit crimes behind bars. I worked on this issue in the Florida legislature as well. Even though they are prisoners, there are many cases where public safety is truly at risk, such as crimes aiding in physical and sexual violence against the public. Can you discuss what steps the wireless industry has taken to help address this problem, and what challenges exist to crack down on this contraband?
Congressman, thank you for your question, and thank you for your leadership and attention to this very important issue. We don't want our wireless devices to be misused in the way that you're being described, and so we have fully embraced working directly with state departments of corrections, working with the Bureau of Prisons, working with the FCC to find solutions to this growing problem. There's no one way to solve this issue. It takes a mix of technology and processes to address the issue. We've actually worked and tested various solutions that could help the state officials identify where these devices are used and then help us to stop them. But we probably need some more teeth to really make it a deterrent for the use of these contraband devices. And so, we do think that, for example, maybe putting the FCC as the cop on the beat to do something there could be helpful. But we certainly appreciate your leadership and attention to this issue.
And again, I'm willing to sit down again with you and all of you to find a solution to this problem because we are going to file some legislation. So any input you have, please don't hesitate. And then, again, I'd like your support on these issues, but of course you have to look at the final draft before you make a decision. In closing, I want to highlight the importance of the McNerney-Bilirakis READI Act to the people of my district on the coastal end of Florida. Actually, I'm in the Tampa Bay area, the coastal area of Tampa Bay. This bill can save lives by ensuring FEMA emergency messages get to at-risk people during a hurricane or flood. And I thank the chairman for the READI's Act inclusion at this legislative hearing. And if anyone would like to comment on that particular piece of legislation, I'd be happy to listen.
Again, Congressman, thank you very much for your leadership and your support of that bill. From our perspective, wireless emergency alerts have quickly become one of the most effective alerting tools in the country. We need to ensure that consumers continue to trust the information that they're getting from the wireless emergency alerts, and make sure that alert originators who send the alerts to warn us, to get us to evacuate from these areas, have the tools and the training that they need to be able to use it most effectively. The READI Act can help do that by encouraging alert originators to develop best practices, to avoid false alerts, to harness the new capabilities we've just rolled out in wireless emergency alerts. As Chief Gosner mentioned, there's all new capabilities that just came online last year, thanks to hard work from the FCC, from the wireless industry, and from FEMA. And so we're looking forward to continuing to improve and keep wireless emergency alerts a trusted source.
I appreciate it very much. And anyone else? I don't have much time. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity for us to have this public hearing so that the public can understand a little bit more as to why all of these issues are so important to individuals and family members across our country. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Gosner, and all of you for your expertise, but Mr. Gosner and thousands of firefighters and first responders in California and across the country who are on the front lines every day, risking their lives to protect everybody from devastating fires and other disasters. I'm glad we have an opportunity today to discuss the importance of technology and wireless communications in emergencies and natural disasters, and also to explore ways to strengthen America's telecommunications infrastructure to ensure public safety. Last year, during its 7,860 wildfires, California experienced significant cell phone service interruptions during these disasters. In one county, over half of the 280 cell phone tower sites lost service, while some landlines experienced connectivity failures. These fires threaten not only American lives, but homes, businesses, and wildlife. As climate change worsens, these wildfires will only continue to grow in intensity, frequency, and ferocity as they have in recent years. We need to bolster our telecommunications infrastructure to ensure their resiliency during emergencies. I welcome today's thoughtful discussion, and my first question is to you, Mr. Gosner. For many of us, it's obvious why we want to be able to communicate during a natural disaster, but I worry that some don't necessarily understand the importance of doing all we can to keep our networks up and running. Can you explain a little more about why it is so vital for public safety officials to be able to communicate with the public during a natural disaster?
Sure, thank you for the question. It is imperative that we build a system that is resilient enough that can withstand a certain amount of damage. So when that emergency is starting to unfold, we are able to communicate with the public and give them the information that they need to either evacuate or shelter in place or whatever it may be. There's times when it's community members talking to community members through different social media platforms. Those go down as well. It really gives us the ability to notify folks that there is impending danger, and that's really what this is. We'll never be able to build a system that stays 100% all the time. I don't think that's what we're asking, but we need to build some resiliency, some capacity that those towers will last for enough time to notify the folks that we need to notify to get out of harm's way. And that's really what we're looking for, is to build in that resiliency so we can make those notifications.
And there are various ways to do that, correct? I'm sure to the general public, redundancy sounds redundant. It sounds like, who would want to be involved in redundancy? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But when it comes to issues like this, isn't redundancy something that is critical to making sure when something bad happens, there are alternative routes or alternative opportunities to make sure that people can still communicate.
Yeah, so for me, it's not only redundancy, but it's hardening. It's the entire network. You have bare cables going up into a framework of a tower. Insulate those in the wildland urban interface so they can withstand some heat. Simple thing, I think are simple. Maybe they're not so simple, but they seem reasonable. And like I said, we're not going to build something that's going to last forever, but we need to be able to provide the assurance to the community that we can get them the alerts that they need to get out of harm's way.
Can you briefly discuss what it was like for residents in Santa Rosa who were without phone or internet service during the wildfires that devastated their community?
Yeah, it was complete pandemonium. You know, it ranged from all of the emotions you can expect. And not only could we not communicate, that meant we had to go in there and knock on doors and use sirens and get everyone out. And then you had to get everyone out while the fire was chasing you through the community. So when you lose connectivity this is a no-notice event, which is different than a hurricane. We all kind of know when a hurricane's coming for the most part, so you can prepare a little bit differently. But this was one of those no-notice events that is very impactful to the community and public safety when it is happening in your neighborhood. And it is happening up and down the state, as we have witnessed for a long time, right? So I go back to the Valley Fire in 2015 in Lake County, and from that you can tick off the fires in the state of California, both northern and southern.
A responsible thing for us to do as Congress, in my opinion, is to make sure that the Resilient Networks Act actually gets through the process and signed into law so that locals can actually reap the benefits of this important legislation. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gianforte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I especially want to thank you for including H.R. 4194, the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act of 2019, in today's hearing. This is a critical piece of legislation that can help Americans facing a crisis. Our nation truly faces an epidemic of suicide, and Montanans, tragically, are all too familiar with it. Montana has the highest suicide rate in the nation. Unfortunately, mental health care is not available to many Montanans. In fact, more than 600,000 Montanans live in an area where there is a shortage of mental health professionals. Last year, I held 2 mental health and substance abuse roundtables in Montana. Providers and experts described the need for more resources to address mental health care and prevent suicide. We need a multi-pronged approach to combat this tragic situation. Ideally, everyone would have access to preventive mental health care. Folks who live in rural and frontier communities face overwhelming obstacles to receive mental health care. That's why the 988 is so important. The goal of the National Suicide Hotline is to ensure people know about and have access to the services they need in the face of a crisis. Our bill provides this essential service for anyone facing a mental health crisis and helps our communities grow healthier and stronger. In addition to this bill, I've also introduced a bill with Representative Beyer to conduct a national suicide prevention campaign. We need to ensure that those struggling with depression, anxiety disorders, and other mental illness don't feel stigmatized. Everyone needs to know that it's okay to ask for help, and in the case of an emergency, where they can find it. I thank you again for the opportunity to discuss this important piece of legislation, and I look forward to seeing the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act signed into law. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Committee now welcomes one of our most esteemed members of the full committee to the subcommittee. Mr. Engel, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I want to speak about an issue of critical importance that has flown under the radar for quite some time, which is the preservation of a life-saving radio spectrum known as the T-band. For decades, the T-band has supported vital public safety radio communications among our first responders. It allows police, firefighters, and EMS providers to communicate even when cell towers, electricity, or the internet are down. It functions deep underground in tunnels and inside concrete buildings. But now, thanks to a provision of law passed back in 2012, the FCC is required to relocate and auction the T-band spectrum for use by the private sector in 2021. This would endanger crucial public safety communications, where in my district, in Bronx, New York, and Westchester, New York, as well as in major metropolitan areas across the United States. It would also force police, firefighters, and EMS providers to spend billions of dollars to change their systems and buy new equipment. According to the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council and the GAO, roughly $6 billion would be needed to relocate public safety users off the T-band. The cost of the New York area alone would be $1.4 billion. In December 2019, FCC Chairman Pai underscored the importance of this issue by writing, and I quote him, "The agency has extensively analyzed the T-band and concluded that moving forward is not viable. I'm calling on Congress to repeal the T-band mandate. I'm hoping that Congress can resolve this matter without delay," unquote. The GAO agreed, reporting to Congress that the T-band mandate is unworkable and could deprive first responders of their current ability to communicate by radio. The urgent need to address the issue was clear. To further emphasize the point, I'd like to submit some letters to record, including a letter dated December 9, 2019, from the International Association of Fire Chiefs, the International Association of Firefighters, the National Sheriff's Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Public Safety Telecommunications Council, the Greater Boston Police Council, the Los Angeles Regional Interoperable Communication System, and others. A letter dated November 13, 2019, from the New York State County Executives Association. A letter dated October 8, 2019, from the New York State Association of Counties. A letter dated August 2, 2019, from the Police Commissioner of the City of New York. A letter dated July 2019, from public safety officials in Harris County, Texas. And a letter dated June 24, 2019, from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities. I have more letters, but I'll stop for now. To resolve this issue, I introduced the bipartisan Don't Break Up the T-Band Act. My legislation would repeal the 2012 provision of law that is at the heart of this problem and would allow law enforcement, fire officials, and EMS providers to continue using the T-band spectrum to operate their radios for day-to-day life-saving operations. Mr. Chairman, thank you for including my legislation in this hearing. I understand that our ranking member, Mr. Walden, has also introduced legislation, the First Responder Act, to address this issue. I look forward to working with Mr. Walden and the rest of our colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee to harmonize our legislation and resolve this issue. Today's hearing also includes other bills that are of critical importance to improve communication networks in times of emergency. Included among them is the Resilient Networks Act, which picks up where the Sandy Act left off and will ensure that communications networks are prepared for the worst. Let me ask Mr. Gerst, let me ask you this question. My city New York City, was devastated by Superstorm Sandy. The destruction was immeasurable. Can you tell me what lessons the wireless industry learned from the storm, and whether we're better prepared today than we were back in 2012? In your view, will legislation in front of our subcommittee today help prepare us for future storms and rising seas?
Congressman, thank you so much for the question. Yes, the Superstorm Sandy was sort of a touchstone moment for our industry and led to the development of the Wireless Resiliency Cooperative Framework, including through the leadership of Chairman Pallone. That framework, its pillars were increasing coordination and collaboration between wireless providers who were competitive, but they have done things since Superstorm Sandy, like sharing resources, repairing each other's towers, making sure each other's customers can use service on each other's networks. We've also increased local coordination through new best practices from the local governments, and we have enhanced our consumer education tools all under the framework because of Superstorm Sandy. In my testimony, I go through a number of different examples of how we think our networks are stronger, and we know that there's more that can be done. That's why we're supporting the goals of the Resilient Networks Act. It has some of the very similar pillars as our framework. It has enhanced collaboration and coordination. It has making sure that wireless providers are have reasonable and flexible expectations around roaming, mutual aid, and backup power, and it's forward-looking in terms of how can 5G and advanced resiliency. So we are making steady improvements on resiliency in the wake of Superstorm Sandy.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair requests unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. A letter from APCO, a letter from Craig Fugit, former FEMA administrator, a letter from IAFF, a letter from Mental Health Liaison Group, a letter from NAB, a letter from the National League of Cities, a letter from U.S. Telecom, a letter from Reps. Moulton and Stewart on H.R. 4194, a Chairman Pallone letter to the GAO about the 2017 hurricane season. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. I want to remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared, and I would ask that each witness respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. At this time, the committee is adjourned.